I am here with Dr. Elizabeth Jackson, who is philosophy professor at Ryerson University. Thanks so much, Liz, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. And sorry, there's a kind of intense storm outside, so I apologize if you hear some thunder.
Do you have some credence that there's a storm outside?
You might be wondering what that is.
What is credence?
Yeah, so credences are basically like your confidence level that some statement is true. And philosophers often measure your credence on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 is you're certain that it's false, and then 1 is that you're certain that it's true. You could also do 1 to 100, so you're 0% sure versus 100% sure, but most philosophers do 0 to 1. So my credence that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is 1. I'm certain, I'm sure that 1 plus 1 equals 2. But let's suppose the forecast predicts a 90% chance of rain tomorrow. Then it would be natural for my credence that it will rain tomorrow to be 0.9, so a little bit less than 1. Moving down the scale, if you're going to flip a coin, then I would have a 0.5 credence that your coin would land heads. And then, like I said, I have a 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow. So then I would have a 0.1 credence that it won't rain tomorrow, that it'll be sunny all day or whatever. And then I have a very low credence that I'll finish everything on my to-do list this week, for example, because I normally don't. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so when people say that they're on the fence, are they at 0.5?
Or they could be around 0.5. So you might be on the fence, but think something's like slightly more likely than not, so you could be at 0.55 or 0.45, but you would probably normally be around the 0.5 range.
Okay, so credence has a lot to do with our confidence in something being true. So it's all about truth and...
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, so it is related to truth for sure. And a lot of people think credences should be accurate, which means they aim at the truth in some way. But one way to think about what a credence is it's sort of like a subjective probability or your own personal probability that you would assign to certain statements. And a lot of epistemologists think about it as some kind of mental state. So it's sort of this thing in your head. And then we can also ask questions about rational credences, right? So maybe rational credences are the ones that are accurate and aimed at the truth.
So a credence is a mental attitude?
Yeah, yep. Just like belief and hope and desire and faith, that's a great list. And so, yeah, I think it's very natural to think as credence as one of these mental states, is a type of mental state similar to these other mental states. And I will say, though, that some epistemologists treat credences more like a modeling tool than a mental state. So if you see me, walk outside with an umbrella, then it's natural to kind of model me as having a 0.9 credence that it will rain or something, or, a high credence that it will rain at the very least. But I think most epistemologists are open to thinking it's not just about modeling people, but we actually do have credences in the same way we have beliefs and desires and all that.
Okay, wait. So let's talk about these different mental attitudes or mental states. You mentioned belief, and now I'm curious, what is the difference between credence and belief if they're both mental attitudes that you can have about something being true?
Yeah, so I love this question, and this is actually my dissertation topic, and you're totally right. So one important thing that both credence and belief have in common is that they're had about statements. So I might have a 0.9 credence in the statement, it'll rain tomorrow, and I also believe the statement that it will rain tomorrow. So they have that in common. But here's what's different about them. So notice that with credences, we have this different credences in between 0 and 1. The credences can be pretty specific. So if I'm about to roll a dice and there's a 33% chance that the dice lands either 2 or 3, then I might have a 0.33 credence in that statement. It's pretty specific, right? Beliefs aren't so specific. Beliefs are much more general. It's what philosophers would call coarse-grained. It basically means they're in some way thicker than credences. So most epistemologists who work on belief think there are actually only 3 belief-like attitudes that you can take towards any statement. So you can believe it, you can withhold belief on it, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier when you're undecided, you're on the fence, or you can disbelieve it. So, going back to some more examples, I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I believe it will rain tomorrow, but I withhold belief that this coin will land heads, the coin you're about to flip. I also withhold belief that there's an even number of hairs on my head. And then I disbelieve that it will be sunny all day tomorrow. So there's really only these 3 belief states. And then credences, we have like all these other more specific states in between. So that's one of the main differences.
Okay, interesting. So credences can be synonymous with some kind of quantitative confidence, and it's similar to beliefs, but these are 2 separate things, and you've got a bunch of arguments to show that they are. But helping me understand the similarities, you said they're both mental attitudes. Can you help me understand mental attitudes better?
Yeah, so a mental attitude, one way to think about it is it's a thing that's in your head. It's not a very precise definition, but we can make it more precise. So one thing that mental attitudes do is they affect our speech and our action. So, going off of our earlier example, let's say I believe it will rain tomorrow, or I have a 0.9 credence it will rain tomorrow. And then you say, hey, is it going to rain tomorrow? I would say yes, because I believe and have that high credence. And then again, I might carry an umbrella with me when I leave the house tomorrow. So these mental attitudes affect what we say and how we act. They also oftentimes have content. So my belief has the content, it will rain tomorrow, so does my credence. I could also hope that it would be sunny tomorrow. So these mental attitudes often have content, but maybe not always. So emotions are an example of a mental attitude. You might be afraid of, a scary monster under your bed, but some people think you could just be afraid in general without being afraid of something in particular. So some mental attitudes might not have content. The final thing, oh, go ahead.
Do credences always have content?
Yeah, that would be the view. At least the most popular view. I've never heard of a view on which they don't, but that would be interesting, I guess. So yeah, credences and beliefs are had towards propositions. That's at least the most standard view, where proposition is basically just a statement that's true or false. But yeah, some of these other mental states may not always have content. And then I guess, I was just gonna say the last thing about mental states is that they can be rational and they can be irrational. That's kind of a whole other topic, but a lot of philosophy is devoted to questions about, what makes a belief rational, what makes a credence rational, or, faith was one. Could faith be rational? That's actually something I've done some research on. So those are some characteristics of mental states.
So you've given us a ton of examples of mental states, of which credence is one. And it's one in addition to similar states like belief and faith. What makes credence special or more important?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say more important, because I think a lot of these mental states actually have really important roles to play. For example, faith. I actually think faith is a super important one. Faith often helps us maintain our commitments over time, and I think we might talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I think credences have a very unique function when compared to some of these other mental states. And what they help us do is they help us act and reason when we're uncertain about something that's relevant. So, you could just be like thinking about philosophy or physics and then use your credences just to kind of think about something for fun and say, well, I'm pretty sure that like abstract objects exist, but I'm not positive, so that's one example. But I think in other cases, credences are actually really, really important and useful in decision making, right? So let's say I'm trying to buy car insurance and I'm trying to figure out if I should get just the really basic one that basically covers almost nothing, or a more expensive plan that will, basically cover my entire car if I get into a wreck. And so what I need to think about when I'm trying to make that decision, what is my credence that I will get into a wreck? Depending on how high it is, Or if my credence is pretty low, then it's probably best for me to go with the cheaper plan. So I'm uncertain about whether I'll get in a wreck, and so credences come into play. So that's one example. Another thing that I think is super interesting about credences is that some of the psychological evidence shows that we tend to rely on our credences when the stakes are really high. So here's an example I've given in some papers before. Let's say you share an office with someone named Rachel, which I did in grad school. My friend Rachel, she was also a grad student at Notre Dame. And excuse me, let's say I come into the office one morning and I see Rachel's coat and backpack. And then my friend Sam is like, hey, is Rachel in the office today? And because I saw her coat and backpack, I believe she was in the office. So I have a belief Rachel is in today. And then I act on that belief by telling Sam, yes, Rachel's in today. Right. Okay, so then let's say later in the day, something really unexpected happens and there's a murder on the Notre Dame campus. Yeah, I know. So the cops are there, they're doing interviews with people, and they're trying to figure out who was around campus that day because they need to make a list of all the suspects for the murder. Okay, I never actually saw Rachel, right? I only saw her coat and backpack. So, she could have left them there overnight, right? She could, maybe someone else dropped them off for her, but she never actually came to campus. So when Sam asks me if Rachel's in, I'm going to say, yeah, Rachel's in. I just rely on my belief Rachel's in and it's fine. But then the stakes get really high. Like, this is going to determine whether Rachel is a suspect for this murder case or not, right? And so when I talk to the police, instead of just using a belief that Rachel's in today, I'm instead going to move to my credence. And I have a pretty high credence Rachel's in today, probably 0.9 or higher, right? Because the coat and backpack is pretty good evidence. But I'm not just going to say, yep, Rachel's in today. I'm going to express my credence instead. I'm going to say, well, I'm pretty sure Rachel's in today, but I'm not positive. I saw her coat and backpack, but I didn't actually see her. So I think that's super interesting too, that credences help us be really precise about our evidence when the stakes are really high.
Is it because credences have the scale and so there's numbers? Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's because credences help us. So here's the way that I've put it before. Think about painting a wall. When you paint a wall, you use a roller brush to sort of paint the big parts of the wall. Mistakes are pretty unlikely. You just need to kind of slather the paint over it as efficiently as possible. But when you're painting like the corners or around the door, you're going to get this detail brush that's really specific because you really need to make sure you don't make a mistake. And you could paint the entire wall with a detail brush, but that would take so much work, right? You could also paint the whole wall with a roller brush, but in certain points it would be really sloppy and inaccurate. And so that's kind of what beliefs and credences are doing. Beliefs are helping us when we just need to take a stand on whether something's true or false. And it's so much easier to reason just holding it fixed that Rachel is in today, for example. But in other cases, we need the precision that credences give us. And we need to say, I do believe Rachel's in today, but I'm not sure. I'm not positive. And credences let us have that level of precision saying, my evidence supports this. It's pretty likely, but I'm not 100% sure. So that's the function that credences play that I think beliefs don't.
And that might answer the question, what's so cool about credences compared to these other ones? Okay, interesting. So I have a question about your case, but I guess we could generalize. It sounded like you were saying that in some scenarios, like the Rachel case, credence has something to do with evidence, whereas beliefs don't necessarily. Or is that what you meant to say? Or can you help me understand? There's something here about evidence and credence.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Okay, so here is how I would put it. Credences are very specific. So they're sensitive to very small changes in evidence. Let me give an example. Let's say I check the forecast on my phone. There's a 95% chance of rain tomorrow. So I believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, and I have a 0.95 credence, okay? And then I'm going about my day, and then I check the weather again. And now there's only a 90% chance of rain. So my credence goes from 0.95 to 0.9, but I keep believing that it will rain. Maybe if I check the forecast and it's down to 0.5 or something, I'll give up the belief as well. But credences help us track these smaller changes in our evidence that beliefs don't always track, because beliefs are this thicker, more coarse-grained thing. So credences are sensitive to all changes in evidence, and beliefs aren't, because you could believe something, but it have a lot of different probability values. That's the thought.
There you are. I lost you for a second.
Okay.
So beliefs and credences are definitely different. Credences are super cool because they're so specific, and beliefs are more general than credences. But can we throw another mental attitude in here? Can we throw faith in here? What are the differences between faith and credence? And if you want to mention belief, go for it.
Yeah, this is one reason that I think studying beliefs and credences is actually really important. So remember, I just gave an example where you got some evidence that made your credence a little bit lower. You went from 0.95 to 0.9, but you keep believing that it will rain tomorrow. And so I think this is interesting, because what it means is that you could have a belief, your evidence can go down, and you can keep believing that thing. And in one of my papers, what I try to argue is that this is actually a way that faith can be rational, but also go beyond the evidence. So I mentioned one thing that I think is important about faith is it helps us keep our commitments over time. And let's say I have faith that my spouse isn't cheating on me and has been faithful to me. And then I get like a little bit of evidence that maybe my spouse was unfaithful to me, but just a little bit. Nothing decisive or proof or anything like that. My credence might go down a little bit, but I can still rationally continue to have faith in my spouse. I think the same thing could happen with faith in God too. You might have a religious commitment, you have faith that there's an all-powerful and all-good God, and then you're like, oh man, there's a lot of evil in the world. Maybe your credence that God exists goes down a little bit, but I think you can nonetheless continue to have faith. And so credences track our specific level of evidence, and that's an important function. But I think belief and faith, especially faith though, lets us kind of maintain these commitments over time, even when we get some counter evidence. So at a certain point, you should give up your faith, right? If you get proof that your spouse cheated on you, or you somehow get proof that God doesn't exist, which I don't even know if that would be possible, but if you get to that, maybe your credence is like almost zero, you need to give up that commitment, right? But your credence can fluctuate, and you can continue in that commitment, and you don't have to be inauthentic. And so one thing that I like to say is I think it helps show how even in the face of doubt, we can maintain our commitments over time.
You're making faith sound just like belief, in that they're both general and they don't have to go up and down with evidence. Is that true? Am I tracking you well?
Yeah, so excuse me, there's a debate about the relationship between faith and belief. And I actually don't think that this view requires that you have to say faith and belief are the same thing, or even that belief always leads to faith or something. Because if there are cases of faith without belief, so let's say once my credence is at 0.6, I can't believe anymore. I need to give up my belief. Maybe if faith is independent of belief, then from 0.6 to 0.5, I could keep having faith even though I need to give that belief up. So faith and belief might have a similar function in some sense, but I actually don't think this view requires us to say that they're the same thing. And here's another really important difference between faith and belief. There's lots of things we believe that we have no desire to be true. So, I believe that there was just a global pandemic. I believe that, my grandma is sick right now, right? I don't have desire for those things to be true, but faith requires a desire, right? If I have faith that God exists, I want God to exist. If I have faith that you're going to win your upcoming basketball game, I want you to win. I'm sort of cheering for your team. I'm on your side, And so because of that, I think saying faith and belief are the same thing just isn't going to work. I think faith and belief actually have quite a few important differences, even though I do think in this example, where they go beyond the evidence, they could function similarly. It might just be that faith goes beyond the evidence more than belief does.
Okay, so somehow we can do a lot of things with our mind, in our mind. One thing we can do is have credence, another is belief, and another is faith. They're not exactly the same thing, they're definitely different. And we can talk about credence separately because it's special because it's so specified. We can have this kind of like scale where we can quantify our confidence in something. Is there anything that we've left out when it comes to credence?
I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary. There's obviously other things we could talk about, and it starts to get kind of technical. So, the requirements on rational credence, because we've just been talking about what credences are. Then there's this whole, it does get a little bit complex here. I could say something briefly if you're interested in that,
Yeah,
but
sounds great. Please.
okay, sure. So one requirement on credence is that they need to be coherent. Okay. So remember we talked about the example where I have a 0.9 credence it will rain tomorrow. Then I should have a 0.1 credence that it won't rain tomorrow. So my credences sort of cohere with each other. In the same way that I shouldn't believe that it will rain tomorrow and believe that it won't rain tomorrow, I shouldn't have a high credence that it will rain tomorrow and have a high credence that it won't rain tomorrow. So this is often called probabilism. It's a big word. Basically, it just means your credences should be coherent. That's one example. And then another thing, so there's often considered to be two requirements on rational credence, at least on the Bayesian picture. So we're talking about Bayesianism now. The second is that when you get new evidence, you should update your credences accordingly. So if I walk outside and see water all over the ground, I should raise my credence that it rained recently. For example. So two things, credences should be coherent, and then we should update credences in light of new evidence. So the first one was called probabilism. The second one is called conditionalization. And that just means that you should take your evidence and then change your credence in accord with what your new evidence says about the probability.
So you're also answering another question. Are you in control of your credences? And it sounds like you are.
This is very, very controversial, actually. So some people think, it's a good question because it's sort of hard to make sense of how can there be these rules we have to follow if we can't even control how our credences move? Like how can we be required to conditionalize if we can't control our credences at all? And I guess what some people might say is, well, these are norms that just let us sort of evaluate credences from the outside. But maybe it's not like we're going to blame you or something if your credences don't follow these rules. So if I was going to argue that we can't control our credences, I would try to say that these are what you might call like evaluative norms rather than like action guiding norms. But I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea that we could change our credences, at least in some situations, especially if there's more than one rational credence that's available to us. So if, there's a 90% chance of rain, we might just kind of automatically latch onto the 0.9 credence. But in a case where maybe like take God's existence and you have like some arguments for God, but then there's a problem of evil, but it's not like there's this one specific credence it seems like you have to have. Maybe in that case, you could have more control over your credences. Some people will hate this. I think a lot of people think you probably can't control your credences, but I actually think this question is kind of underexplored. A lot of the people, there's this view, it's called Doxastic Volunteerism. And basically what it means is we can control our beliefs in some voluntary way. They've really just focused on beliefs. Remember the belief withholding disbelief thing. Haven't really talked much about credences. So I think it would actually be cool for more philosophers to look at the question, can we control our credences? And if so, how would that work? And I think some psychology would bear on this question too.